Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, Gaia Vince, Merlin Sheldrake, Edna Bonhomme and Daisy Hildyard consider how Gaia theory has influenced their practices. This talk was hosted at the As Above So Below event at the Science Gallery.
So we're going to talk about the story of science today because, we understand the world through stories, and science is another part of our culture. And to integrate the science, the empirical different way of looking at the world, which is what science is, into the other parts of our reality, our society, our politics, our other ways of being. We use stories and we use narratives. So I'm just going to introduce these fabulous people. So we have Daisy Hildyard, who is a historian of science and a writer interested in how scientific facts are made and communicated and the idea and reality of the environment through history. She is an award-winning novelist, and her non-fiction book, The Second Body, explores the relationship between individuals and their ecosystem. And Edna Bonhomme, who is behind me on the screen, is joining us from Berlin, and she is a historian of science, a culture writer and editor who explores how people navigate unsavory states of health. And she's especially interested in narratives around contagious disease and outbreaks today and through history, and she's writing a book as well. And then there's Merlin Sheldrake, who is a biologist and writer with a background in plant sciences, microbiology, ecology, and the history and philosophy of science. And his multi-award-winning bestseller, Entangled Life, explores the fascinating role of fungi in our world. So welcome to you all, and thanks for joining us. And we will have questions at the end. So if anything sparks your interest, and I'm sure it will, do prepare some questions. So I'm going to start with you, Merlin, because you are a practicing scientist. And so when we think about some of the amazing things that we explore with our minds, quite often they come from stories, come from fairy stories, and the idea of trees talking to themselves it comes up quite often in fairy stories. There is the protagonist, some child, quite often walking through the forest, and then the trees are whispering and talking, and it's a very evocative environment. And when I first read Suzanne Simard's, about Suzanne Simard's work, I was blown away by the idea that trees really do talk to each other, they do communicate. And in many ways, I also have a science background, that's what drew me and kept me into science. It's that incredible exploration of something more wonderful than what we can imagine in a way. Tell me, how does that influence your work and your work as a scientist, and how did you then interpret that or decide to interpret it for Entangled Life, which is a beautiful book? You really must read it if you haven't already, which you probably have.
Thank you. So I feel that the whole of the living world is embedded in fluid networks of some kinds of communication. I mean, communication can mean many different sorts of things, but the bacteria in your gut are influencing each other and influencing your cells. The different cells and different organs of your body are influencing each other through bioelectrical fluctuations, through hormonal fluctuations, and all sorts of other means. So the living world is in, I think, constant, intimate, reciprocal, communicative interaction all the time. And this is something we do see in traditional stories and mythologies from all around the world, that the world is alive, that the world speaks. It's full of voices, different ways of knowing, different ways of observing. And if we can listen in just the right kind of way, then maybe we'll be able to hear, and maybe, if we're lucky, understand. So when it comes to fungi and trees and plants, I'm fascinated by the way that these fungal organisms communicate with themselves, first and foremost. These branching, fusing networks, which don't have a center of operation, they don't have heads, they don't have hearts. They need to be able to tell whether as they pour themselves into the world, tunneling into their food, whether they're meeting a branch of themselves or a branch of another type of fungus, or is this bacterium going to be an ally in this moment or a threat? And so when they start communicating with plants, this then spirals out into a whole new level, and then, but plants are already communicating with other plants, right? They're already communicating with distant parts of themselves. And they're already communicating with other plants through chemicals they release into the soil, through chemicals they release into the air, with bacteria and the fungi that live in their leaves and in their shoots. So the case that we talk about when we're thinking about plants connected by fungal networks underground and potentially moving material between each other through the fungal networks, it's just a very special case of what is a bustling, communicative world, I find.
I mean, it is a marvelous world, and it is quite challenging when you think of plants almost as inanimate, because the scale of movement is so much slower. The types of communication are so alien to how we communicate socially. We're a completely different social being. How was that challenging when you try to narrate your understanding and your research into this kind of communication that we can't see and we don't know, but is all around us, is everywhere? How did you find that difficult?
Hugely difficult. It's very difficult for people studying fungal life to actually observe fungal life. Most fungal life takes place embedded in their food, out of sight, on a microscopic scale. And so a lot of the work is to render this perceivable somehow, either through sequencing DNA to make up a picture of the communities of fungi, by using microscopes of various different sorts. I work with a team in Amsterdam. We have an incredible system where we have mycorrhizal fungal networks in dishes, and we have a microscope that we can use to see the flows within the networks in real time. And it's wild. It's like watching rivers that flow in two directions at once, with blobs that go down one branch and then change direction and then change back again and then divide in two, and then meanwhile there's bidirectional traffic happening on some other kind of cellular infrastructure. And it's what you see when you look at these living flows is that these are wild dynamical systems in a constant state of activity. But it takes a lot to get that view of the fungi, and it's very hard to do that. So then communicating fungal life to people through words in a book becomes even more difficult, because you're not depending on the video, you're not depending on the stories, the pictures, the images. You can't take people outside and ask them to bury their face in the soil. I mean, you can, but it's hard to make sure that that's something that everyone's going to do as they read the book. Or if indeed that would be helpful for everyone to do. So it's really challenging, and one has to use lots of metaphors and analogies. And of course, scientists are always doing this and always have, because so much of the work of science is dealing with phenomena that take place out of the reach of our immediate senses. And so a lot of communication about science is inherently creative, poetic, metaphorical, analogic. And so for me, one of the fun things was realizing that, accepting that, and then diving in.
Now, as Merlin's just explained, and as this whole program is discussing, we are part of a system. We're all embedded. We're all interconnected. We are all constantly in communication, even if we don't realize it, with all aspects of our world. Now, Daisy, that causes some sort of philosophical jarring in a way, and there is a problem, isn't there, of understanding, where the self ends as an individual. Who are you actually? Where are you in this world? What are the limits of self and the beginning of other? And that's something that you've explored. And give us your thoughts on that. I mean, summarize it in a sentence. No, yes, because this is something we grapple with our whole lives just within the human society, let alone this much bigger biosphere.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you say, it's a massive question, and it's something I think about a lot, rather than that I particularly have a definitive answer for. I don't think I would want to have a definitive answer, because it depends on the context. In certain contexts, it seems to me that it's very important that people have individual self-determination and boundaries to their own bodies that they can assert and claim. But in a lot of contexts, ecological, thinking about human relations with non-humans, for example, that seems very problematic, the kind of a triumph or power of an individual, and a kind of idea that individuals can work in disconnection, that life can happen, or ordinary things that we do in our day-to-day lives can be disconnected from other beings and don't have an impact. That can obviously have violent ramifications, for one thing.
I mean, there's this constant tension, isn't there, between the desires and the wants and the needs of the self, and the demands of the community that we all depend on. I mean, none of us can exist alone, even without our own society. And so there is this constant tension. And when we are embedded in this ecological system, which we are collectively are pushing to various limits, it becomes much bigger and a much more difficult tension to resolve, in a way.
I mean, certainly it feels to me that many people are looking for some more precise or physical sense of understanding about this interconnection. It's often talked about as a kind of theoretical thing, and it's kind of hard to feel that it's happening in your real life. I mean, I think what Merlin talked about as making something seen is definitely something that I think about in writing, and again, just in my normal life, I would like to see and feel many of the phenomena that I know are happening. I think that would help me to respond to them. I feel that I'm talking somewhat abstractly. So there's a phenomenon known as slow violence, I guess, which maybe helps people to think about this. Slow violence is the forms of harm that happen not when you punch somebody in the face or stab them in the back, but over generations. So white supremacy would be a form of slow harm, intergenerational violence. Ecological devastation would be another form of slow harm. So these are things that are not necessarily easy for a person to see. And because of that, it's not very easy necessarily to respond to them or to get out of the systems that I am certainly in that enable them. So I think about that when I'm writing, and I try to think about points of places where these things might be made seen. But there is this difficulty in just the alienness of much of it. You know, if you're trying to write about a mushroom, I don't know what it feels like to be a mushroom. Probably not. It doesn't feel like anything. So I think one of the things that writing can do, or stories can do, I would tentatively suggest, is that you can at least make the difference felt and make some kind of sense of respect or acknowledgement visible. So some kind of gap between different ways of being and a respect for other ways of being, rather than an assumption that there's one way of being and that's kind of needs to dominate over all others, or is better than all others, I guess. Margulis helps a lot with this, I think, with her Gaia theory. This would be one of the visualizations that can help an ordinary person like me to see it among its kind of actual scientific uses and values.
So the writer and storytellers, they make the hidden seen. But in order to do that, of course, when we are talking about things that are hidden, quite often, as you both referred to, we talk about metaphors, and we put a lot of our own interpretation into that. Now, Edna, there is, of course, a danger that the way that we interpret our truth about science, or our perspective of what the science is showing us, particularly when it has, when we are talking about, as we are with every sort of science pretty much, we're talking about something which has real social implications. We can create a narrative that is very harmful. Now, I know that you've looked at disease and the idea of contagion, and that is extremely loaded with all sorts of value interpretations. Tell us a little bit about your work looking at the stories that we tell about disease.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that there are various epistemological ways of thinking about science outside of the European context. But even within that, I've been drawn to the works of Black feminist writers who see science not only in the context of a laboratory phenomenon, but from a very kind of intellectual place of curiosity. So when we think about Catherine McKittrick's work, Dear Science, which was published a couple years ago, she points out, rightly so, that for some, science can be restless, uncomfortable, and situated mostly in this multifarious and downward pressing manner. And similar to what others have noted, there's a rebellion in it for her, and there's a way in which the practice of engaging with science, as she tried to do in her work, also demands people to gather seemingly transparent data and to have some way of documenting, categorizing, and create some form of taxonomy. Nevertheless, I think that one of the things that I, in my work, am trying to move beyond or extract from cultural theorists is to see to what extent does science demand a better language, and not just necessarily the language of chemistry, biology, etc., but also the language of how we can acknowledge the ways in which, as has been previously explained, trees and plants communicate with each other, microbes communicate with each other. The beauty and the brilliance of Gaia theories is that it allows us to chart out how the environment and non-human and human communicate with each other. And I think it would also help us to think about rather than creating hierarchies of language between, as we do already with humans, we should maybe create a more horizontal structure and incorporate and think about how these microbial connections, microbial communications, and non-human communications can provide us and allow us to ask more meaningful and relevant questions within science. When it comes to contagion, this is something that I'm still kind of working through, and specifically thinking about how both disaster and possibility constitute vulnerabilities for certain humans. How, for example, the spectrum of what is considered to be human, along the lines of Sylvia Wynter's work, also determines who survives and who doesn't. And so asking deep questions about the politics of the human, in my opinion, is also a way to think about the politics of the contagion.
I mean, if we look at contagion itself, if we look at being diseased, it's a state where the body is overwhelmed quite often with microorganisms. Even though we are basically microorganisms anyway, we're kind of overwhelmed by that, and there is this narrative around disease. There is this fear of people who are diseased and this othering of the person who is diseased, and there is a different way of describing populations that are undergoing a disease. And so the story that we weave around the telling of different contagions, it could be as simple as labeling a disease, Spanish flu or the China plague or whatever, has a huge role in the understanding, the general understanding of that contagion. But how does it affect the people who are actually undergoing the contagion themselves? Can the story itself actually make them more likely to succumb to the disease? Does it have real effects on them?
Yeah, in a way, stories matter. And this is where I think novelists such as Gyugyo Thiongo's work is so significant. The Kenyan novelist who very much tries to think about how not just language but memory makes us who we are. It shapes how the types of stories we tell, and it ultimately allows us to see which histories die or don't. And so, in a way, the question around contagion and the question around stories within the context of science is quite significant when we think about the hierarchies of power, especially in light of colonization, sexism, and so forth. I would say that what we can do to kind of counteract that as a species is allow storytelling through science to read across materials. That is to say, not just textual knowledge or even oral knowledge from humans, but to think deeply about everything from the microbe to the mystical and to engender practices of solidarity and collaboration that allow us to construct imaginative new geographies of the body, of the human, from a biological sense, a taxonomic sense, and so forth. In that sense, this is where I would say that, in a way, Gaia theory, by not just focusing on the human and by allowing space for the world, specifically the natural world, to flourish, allows us to think more deeply about this kind of human, non-human symbiosis. And it reminds me somewhat of James Bennett's Think Power, that is to say, the idea, the sense that we can try to hone in on a vital materialism where human and non-humans have power in a more kind of symbiotic fashion. And it also gives space for thinking also about the possibility of stabilization as opposed to antagonisms that we see so often from anthropomorphic forces. So all of this is just to say that I'm for thinking about the possibility of symbiosis, of solidarity practices within the context of science, as opposed to just the ways in which it has been used to reinforce hierarchies of the human.
Now, we understand the world very, very fundamentally through storytelling and through stories. Our brains are wired cognitively to understand the world through stories, to understand them through actors that play a role, and there is a narrative to everything that goes on. We form stories even when we see animations of little cubes moving on a square. We describe them as in competition or having a personality. I'm wondering, Merlin, the stories that you have, the narrative that you've wove, and the stories that you've told through to explain this deep interconnected world that is around us in Entangled Life, has that driven a change or inspired scientists to look differently at their world, to see it through that story instead of the story that they may have inherited through their formal education and through academia? Have you heard back from anybody that has changed their practice or thought differently?
Well, I've talked to friends who about it, and we can laugh and joke about it and talk freely about it together. And some of them have said that yes, that they felt invited to consider some familiar concept from a new angle. I personally find when I engage with any kind of creation, human creation, that the things that I find most impacting are those that invite me to see the familiar as unfamiliar again, the things that defamiliarize the familiar. And so this line from Eliot, to arrive where one started and see it as if for the first time. This is something that all of these ideas do to me when I think about them. And it's something that, yes, that I play with my scientific colleagues. But I think it's important to also remember, in the context of the history of the study of symbiosis, that this has been a science that has been particularly beset by all sorts of competing narratives about how organisms are interacting. From master and slave, relationships between men and women, relationships between nations, all sorts of different kinds of diplomatic metaphors, moving right forward to a kind of utopic caring and sharing, hyper-capitalistic jostling on the floor of a market, of a stock exchange. And we see our own societal values, or the societal values of those doing the describing, dispersed through the prism of symbiotic interactions. So it's a particularly interesting place to look at narrative, to look at the way that, and not only we project narrative onto the world, but then we take that view of the world to naturalize our own behavior. And so you see this two-way process of putting narrative into these interactions, and then using that narrative to justify our interactions. So I spend a lot of time engaging with this, with various different symbiotic scientists, and we tease each other endlessly about the narratives, and we play games about quickly changing the narrative and seeing whether that causes us to see the phenomenon in front of us in different ways, and it does, of course.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Our idea of what is natural, what is nature, what does it mean to be good or bad, as well, and the whole religiosity as well in the history of interactions like that. So the role of the storyteller is extremely powerful and extremely important. And at the moment, we are facing multiple global planetary crises that are beyond us as an individual to have the agency to deal with, and can feel very overwhelming. And yet, collectively, we could deal with them, and we are able to react. What is the role of the storyteller in this? How can the storyteller help us come to terms with things that are overwhelming in a way that helps change our behavior, I guess?
I think it can. I think it's one thing among many. I wouldn't want to say there is a story that can be told that will solve all this shit. And I also believe that academics or scientists are storytellers as well, of course, and there are many different kinds of stories that are happening in our world. So I wouldn't kind of limit that to the novel. I do think that there is, as a novelist, I guess I should kind of say I feel it's a bit arrogant to call myself a historian of science. My PhD was studying scientific texts, but I haven't done any real research for about 10 years now. So just, that's a kind of inflated claim for me.
No, but you're somebody who uses storytelling, either in fiction or non-fiction, to help us understand ourselves and our world in a different way, and that's a really valuable thing that we all need in society. But it's also quite powerful. Do you feel the responsibility? Do you feel it? Do you feel something I feel external sort of looking over you?
No, not at all. I don't think I could publish or write really if I thought about external, people reading over my shoulder. But what I do feel is is the joy and excitement of going out into the world, and of all this world that there is to explore. I think that while I wouldn't want to, as I said, kind of over assert the role of storytelling or the role of fiction in particular, I think, of course, there's a massive connection to me between the fact that there's so little presentation of any of these stories in our fiction, in our HBO series or in our great novels. Tolstoy has a few horses. He's pretty good on animals, but there's not so much in our literature. The thing I always say is there are probably more novels about marriage altogether than there are about the whole of the non-human world. And often when non-humans do appear in our novels, they're images or kind of they will represent something rather than be somebody. So as a writer, I find that really exciting, and with my last novel, I kind of set myself the adventure, I guess, if that's not too much, to try to write a novel that did have many non-human characters in it, including some mushroom hi-fi and forests and foxes. And it was fun, and I guess kind of, playful, experimental, tentative. I think there are many, many other ways of doing it, but for me it feels like, as a writer, it feels like an exciting, so much world to explore and to make stories about. I don't think writers do so well when they come with something sitting on their shoulders that they need to tell you.
I mean, the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we live by are very shaped by our social norms, by our society. And I think it's quite interesting that there is an enormous amount of research now that shows that the heavily sort of individualistic Western narrative does quite often play the human as the protagonist, sort of, and the other characters, the other parts of our natural world as sort of almost either to feed and serve us or as objects to be moved around and controlled by us. But many indigenous societies, humans are just another player in a much more level ecosystem. And there have been many studies showing how children play and how children weave stories around narratives. I wonder if, Edna, you think that there is value and a different way of understanding the world through trying to see it through a different worldview, a different perspective, trying to immerse yourself in stories from other perspectives.
Well, one thing I would say is that I would agree with Daisy that I don't know if stories in themselves will solve the problems of the world that we live in, from climate change, racism, etc. What they can do and offer us is an escape. They can entertain us. They can make us feel joy, or we can, in some cases, not be drawn or seduced by the story. Nevertheless, I would say that within the context of storytelling and what people that I admire have offered in the past, I would say that science fiction writers like Ursula Le Guin and Octavia Butler have done the diligent work of really laying out how those who've been dispossessed or often may not necessarily have power, or as much power within the context of the human, have allowed space for thinking actively about coming together and surviving in a communal fashion. The two books of theirs that most notably do this, in my opinion, for Octavia Butler is Parable of the Sawyer, which focuses on a young teenage African-American girl, Lauren Alamina. And that's important insofar that up until that point, there were very few stories that had a Black female protagonist kind of allowing space for a group of people to somehow find some kind of healing or salvation in the context of a climate crisis. And as most of the audience members know as well, Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed also provides space for thinking about how capitalism and the brand of capitalism we live in is quite disastrous, and it shows how more specifically humans have ruined the planet. And I bring those things up just to point out that there have been and there continues to be people who are narrating and thinking actively about disaster and the havoc that humans cause. And I can name others like N.K. Jemisin and so forth. But if we move to what your question was pointing to, which is how do we think about different knowledge systems, I think Robin Wall Kimmerer's work, Braiding Sweetgrass, which looks at indigenous wisdom, scientific knowledge, and teachings of plants, provides in a quite beautifully creative nonfiction manner how the environment that she's in as an indigenous person speaks to her ancestors, and her ancestors are also part of it. And so that's one example of the many ways in which people, especially those who've had to deal with dispossession, settler colonialism, are trying to look to nature actually as an archive, as a way to construct a new narrative about their existence and their connection to their ancestors. But obviously, there's not one way to do this, especially when people have experienced some form of rupture, either through chattel slavery or even just linguistic shifts and losing one's language for whatever reason. But it is something I do think that the storytelling and the narrative has been happening, and there's from science fiction to indigenous scholars, people have been trying to do that work.
Yeah, that's some great books to look up there as well. Thank you, Edna. So, I mean, if we look at this way of seeing the world as communicative and as entirely interconnected, and think of this kind of this paradox, I guess, that everything has agency. You know, everything has some form of cognition and decision making, whether we're talking about fungi or whether we're talking about humans. But at the same time, that's very limited because everything is interconnected, and we are also held sway by the bacteria inside us, and everything is constantly cooperating and conflicting and adjusting for each other. I think it's quite interesting that this is almost the most intuitive narrative we come up with. I mean, children already apply agency to everything, to beetles, they have conversations. My children had conversations with worms and mud and their teddy bears and inanimate objects as well. And it's almost as if that playful understanding of the world is trained out of us as we get older, and we think that actually we are the only beings capable of this sort of agency, and we are somehow, there is a hierarchy of species. We lose it. How do we get it back? I mean, this is the story. If you look at children's books, I mean, what you were saying is so true about adult books, but of course, children's books, that all the animals they all speak. They are quite often the only characters. There are no humans in the stories at all, and that is very much almost how we come into the world, how we think about the world. In fact, if I just very obnoxiously take over slightly here, I would say that one of the most purest realizations I had. So I understand I've been immersed in this science for over a decade. I understood well over a decade the Gaia theory and all of these ideas, but I had kind of the purest realization of this, I think, when I was pregnant and I was suddenly two people at once, two beings at once. And then after I had my baby, I felt there was this weird sort of connectivity, which was chemical, biological, psychological, all of those things. And you realize that you're not an individual at all. You're very connected to another individual. And I think there must be other ways of understanding this narrative before then, in an emotive way, in a very strong. And it's not just me. I think my male partner, also felt a lot of these emotions. How do we get it back? I'd like us all to discuss this. Actually, it's not to anybody individually.
Yeah. Does anybody have any ideas? Because we could do with some. Hello.
Yeah, so one of the members of the audience has just said that we feel it when somebody dies, and there is that community aspect, and we somebody is no longer alive, but yet their personhood and their being is still part of us. It's the kind of limits to the self when we live in this very social world it's very hard to pin down, isn't it?
Well, I would agree with you that I think that this is something that is probably learned out, or sometimes a person will have the experience of being an individual, but there's an assumption that is a baseline, and occasionally a person can have an experience, for example, for you, being pregnant at maternity wasn't that experience for me particularly, but I've written about the kind of bad logic of calling a person in labor an individual. Their body is literally dividing into two bodies. So the idea of the individual is simply just quite illogical there. And there are these other kind of moments of connection. I think are called, Bruce Robbins has written about something he calls the sweatshop sublime. This kind of swoony feeling you might have when you put some clothes on and think about how far the clothes have traveled from the factory on the other side of the world, or that sometimes people might get like a little jolt when you get jolted out of this kind of sense of habitual whatever it is, that exposes that, you know, this isn't necessarily the reality, that our grammar, our memories, our history, our science perhaps suggests is more habitual to us.
Yeah, I agree. I think coming back to these moments of our experience, which where there's these narratives of hyper-individualization, where they wear thin, revealing their fragile underpinnings. This might happen when you're at in a big crowd at a music festival or at a big party. It might happen when you're playing or listening to music, when you're dancing, when you're doing any kind of creative activity, and when you're dreaming, when you're just waking up from a dream state, and everything feels sort of melty and porous. Like, under the influence of psychedelic drugs, in anything we might call a mystical experience, in religious, spiritual context, ritual context, through prayer, breathing activities, choirs, whatever. I think that there are lots of times when we are able to see how fragile some of these narratives are, and how absurd they can be, and how obviously trained into us they have been a lot of the time. Of course, there are very mysterious ways where we do appear to be separate and individual as well, you know, and we have bodies which can exist in different, well, which don't exist in the same place at the same time as another body. So this is not to say that these narratives of individualization are 100% trained into us by the system, but I do think a lot of it is through the kinds of societies that we have chosen to build over the last few centuries.
I mean, that is the conflict, isn't it? The individual and I mean, I think what you were saying earlier there about awe being so important in reflecting back our smallness and the grandeur when you're at a concert that's overwhelming, or there's an incredible waterfall, or you're in a desert and the Milky Way is just the expanse of the skies and that universe out there that make you feel small, but at the same time connected to life, to this living world, which is the only place in the universe where there is life. And I think they are really powerful. Edna, have you experienced something that has shocked you into that sudden realization that we are all connected and that the world is bigger than you?
Yeah, so what I would say is similar to what Daisy and Merlin have pointed out, is that although we are sometimes socialized to not have the open, curious imagination that young children often possess, that as we grow older, it's not always the case that we are removed from those experiences, especially when there are these experiences from, as people you noted, from death to being at a concert, or to even just witnessing nature in its grandeur. What I would say in my context, where I have the way that I navigate the world, is one in which I find myself both in and outside of different cultures, in the sense that I'm a chameleon that moves between living here in Germany, in North America, the Caribbean. I've spent time in North Africa, and just witnessing people and witnessing both the similarities and the particularities between people who find community in, prayer in some cases, people who have practiced voodoo, Sufi, members who have danced. And the act of witnessing others actually has provided me with the idea or sense that maybe there is a world beyond the kind of materialist world that I've constructed for myself. But beyond that, I would say that the witnessing is also an opportunity to find value in those who are able to look at the worthiness of the universe, and find a bit more curiosity than I often see in the European context, and people who engage in an epistemology in which, and I had referred to this when I discussed Robin Wall Kimmerer, the idea or the sense that we are connected to our ancestors, and they're living, they're breathing, and they're part of what makes us who we are. And acknowledging that that is important and significant for some groups actually allows space for the possibility for expanding the imagination in ways that I would say the kind of Western European and North American idea about civility or rationality doesn't allow space for. But in my travels and in just being in the world, have been able to see what value expanding the imagination offers for other people.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful to be able to look back and get that connectivity back through the generations, through time, and realize you have the same nose as your great grandmother, or you speak the same language, you eating the same food, but also that that it's almost a liminal state, I suppose, being able to dip. I also have a background in different nations and countries and cultures, and that not belonging but also belonging, and so that connectivity across all these things is really powerful in showing you a different way of thinking, but also separating you. And I think the separation is also really important to see the alien, the otherness in, the times that you can lie in the grass and just watch ants about their business, very busy, living a completely different, very social life to you, and realize you are so very different, and yet you're on exactly the same square footage of the earth as each other, and your basic biology is remarkably similar. I think that itself is a story that we can explore really fully, to show the interconnectedness, but also the difference. And it is that tension. I don't want to hog the conversation too much, because we've only got a little bit of time for questions. So I'm going to ask if anybody has questions, put your hand up, and there is a roving mic going round for our brilliant panelists. Yes.
Hello. Yeah, I missed the suggestions bit. This is the classic, not exactly a question. I wanted to suggest some resources. There are practices within the Plum Village tradition of Buddhism, also called the community of interbeing, which specifically address this kind of illusion of separation, that are also valuable, and that also address kind of ancestral continuity and so on. And there is a new research group called the Emergent Phenomenon Research Group, which is kind of interdisciplinary, people who are looking at ways of receiving and thinking about those kinds of liminal, sublime experiences you were all just referring to, outside of the immediate pathologizing classification of the DSM. So they're kind of saying, how can we think about these things when the only way to receive them within the Western scientific context, the only filter we have for anything approaching these states, is to apply the closest applicable kind of pathologizing label.
Brilliant. Shall we have some questions as well? Some questions down here.
Hello. I wanted to ask what you think with regards to time perception altering our perception of our relationship with the rest of the world, because you mentioned children, and that's one thing children experience very differently to us. And also you mentioned dreams, Merlin, and that's something that's time perception is very different in dreams, and it gives you much more of a sense of the tapestry of everything happening simultaneously. So I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
That's really interesting, especially as a lot of the ecological changes that happen on a very different time scale, and we're entering a different sort of geological era. So it's the time perception is really important. Anybody got any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's very interesting I spend time exploring the work of processual thinkers like Henry Bergson and Alfred North Whitehead, and I find their work hugely illuminating. And for someone like Bergson, this process of time, it unfolds. It moves. It's like the universe is a kind of giant organism growing in time. Think about like a giant shrub growing from its growing tips. It's not the same in the other direction. There is an arrow to time. Time flows. Whereas for Einstein, and this came to then dominate what we might call today's paradigm of time within the reductive sciences, is that there's a kind of symmetry to time, that because all the equations of physics work in principle one way or the other, that what we experience as the flow of time is an illusion, and that actually it's not that way at all. So this is just two very, very quick examples of radically different ways of conceiving time within a tradition of Western thought within the last 150 years. And if you follow either of them and their implications, it leads you to quite different places and quite different kinds of ways of imagining the way that reality is and unfolds and becomes. So I agree with you. The way we conceive of time is hugely important. And there are lots of ways of doing so, and I like to explore those myself.
Yeah, indeed, the way that we perceive time ourselves changes according to emotions, according to outside influences as well. Time can speed up or slow down. It's yeah. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that, or any other questions? Yeah.
So I was just struck when you were describing your birth experience. I haven't experienced birth, but I have experienced death. And that those are a somatic knowing. And what you're describing there is something that lands in the heart, in the body. It's an emotional, experiential, and often anecdotal experience in that way. So from the Margulis film last night, this shift towards understanding a wider plethora of language and of experience and of acknowledging through the medical profession as well, anecdotal experience, which is something we get in different kind of diseases or pathologies. And so I just wanted to make the distinction between sort of knowing and knowing. And I think that's a strong distinction that we make through practice, and something which practice is absolutely vital for. So ritual practice, meditation practice, Buddhist philosophy. And so my question is, what practices do you have on the panel? What is your practice?
Edna.
So I guess one thing I would say is in the way that Daisy had said that we can't know how a mushroom thinks or what it feels, and it may not feel much per se. I sometimes feel that way about other humans. I can't necessarily know what others are feeling, thinking, etc. And because of as the previous question alluded to, the different subjective experiences we have as we move through the world and the body we occupy. All I can know is myself. Nevertheless, if I'm to think about how I come to know and how I come to move through the world, I do agree that rituals ground me in a way that allows space for dealing with the chaos that is this planet and this earth, mostly due to anthropogenic forces. The rituals that I engage in that bring me joy is just basic. Reading poetry, taking a walk as I did near the river early this morning, reading novels, writing, journaling, and also thinking actively about the types of people who I've been inspired by as scholars and thinkers. One essay that I return to quite regularly is Audre Lorde's The Uses of Erotic, which specifically allows space for thinking about eros, not just in a sexual or romantic sense, but in how seeking love and admiration and joy and pleasure in a kind of comprehensive and multifarious sense. So if I'm to think about the kinds of rituals that make sense for me, or the principle that is a guiding force for how I move through the world in this body as I know it and experience it, I would say that eros is the foundation, and figuring out how that how pleasure can be an opportunity for someone like me to live through the world is ultimately my goal. And that's especially a political point that is significant given that as a descendant of slaves who were stolen and brought to the Caribbean, I think it's especially important to center eros when that was very much denied to my ancestors. So it's not a complete answer, and it doesn't necessarily follow a path or tradition that might be familiar to most people, but it's my own kind of negotiation and compromise given my history.
Thank you, Edna. That was really very thoughtful and thought-provoking. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, also, yeah, thanks. That was a really beautiful response. And no, I don't actually.
There are so many things that I do to stay balanced and to stay open and to stay curious and imaginative. I couldn't possibly list them all, but some of them include fermenting foods and drinks, swimming in wild places, breathing, music, engaging with loved ones, celebration, so many things.
Yeah, I too. I like to be taken out of myself by being immersed in nature or being somewhere awe-inspiring. And you can find awe in again, that's the beauty for me of science, that you see something and then you have that added understanding and explanation of what the hell's going on there. It's just, and then it draws you further in. But also community, being somewhere where everybody is connected through laughter and conversation, and of course the arts, music, beautiful painting. I think it's in our very busy lives, it's increasingly important, especially as we have built these environments made of just a few materials, concrete, steel, glass, to try and find space to take ourselves out of that and experience that connectedness of the mind and the body knowing that. I think it is very important, and I think it for me anyway, I feel kind of unhealthy if I don't, I feel stressed if I don't do it enough. This has been so great for me to talk to our wonderful three guests, Daisy Hildyard, Edna Bonhomme, and Merlin Sheldrake. Please do look out their work, and thanks to you for joining us for this. I will just add to the previous speakers and say that Gaia and Philosophy by Lynn Margulis is on sale outside with a new introduction by her son Dorian Sagan. And thanks very much. Please thank our wonderful panelists.
Can I say one more thing about Margulis, actually? Because I've been thinking about what she would think about us talking about this. And I feel that she was always, or certainly seemed to me to come across to be very precise about the scientific application and the words that she used, and not extrapolating too wildly from a scientific theory, as I personally like to do. But I've also been thinking about this tension that keeps coming up about between the self and the connection, and thinking about now. If there are any scientists here, well, there are certainly some scientists here. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But my understanding of Margulis's particular understanding of the Gaia theory is that where Lovelock saw the world and described the world, the globe, as a single organism, Margulis saw it as a patchwork of interconnected ecosystems, which you couldn't put a wall around, which all kind of affect one another, but which are nonetheless discrete and can't be described as a single whole. And I think that's a really lovely and probably totally inappropriately applied image for this kind of tension between the individual and the collective, or the interconnected, that seems to be coming up from so many of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And they are discrete, but they are also interconnected. So we have to use metaphors. We have because all we have is our language, and it's limiting in a way, isn't it? Thank you. Thanks, Daisy. Thanks all.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.